All right, so today we are going to continue graphing sine and cosine, but we're going to talk about some horizontal shifts to the left and to the right. All right, so what I want you to do here, okay, we've talked about transformations. What I want you to do, if given if f of x is x to the third and g of x is x plus 2, all quantity raised to the third power, I want you to describe the shift from f to g. Take a second, write it down. Hopefully, you were able to get it's a horizontal shift to the left, to the left, to the left, 2. All right. Why don't you now pause your video and factor 4 out of each of these two quantities here. Okay, do a little algebra review here. Factor out the 4 in those two examples. Alright, so this first one, the 4 factors out nicely. 8 divided by 4 is 2. Okay. The second one here, the 4 factors out. Okay. However, it becomes a fraction. Okay. So I've 2 divided by 4 is how you want to think of it. Well, 2 divided by 4 is just 1/2. If you distribute that 4 times x will give me 4x. 4 times 1/2 will give me negative, or give me 2. Okay, so it does still work. Alright, so now we want to think about factoring out a b from this quantity. Well, if I take out this b, I'm left with x. And similar to what we did here, 2 over 4 gave me 1/2. I'm going to subtract c over b. Okay, this is going to become very important today now that we're talking about horizontal and vertical shifts. Or excuse me, horizontal shifts. In the next video, we'll talk about vertical. Alright, these are our two functions, okay, graphed. Alright, this is our sine function without any smushing or like shrinking or anything like that to our period, or expanding our period, shrinking vertically or horizontally, none of that. Same thing here, no flip, nothing going on. That's our original. Alright, that's our parent function, if you will. Okay, let's talk about our generic function again. Let's revisit this. Okay, prior to this, we've talked about our amplitude. Our amplitude, which is our absolute value of our A value. Remember, this is a vertical stretch or shrink, depending on what the number is. Okay. To find our period, remember, we do 2 pi over our B value. Okay, and this is a horizontal stretch or shrink. Or horizontal shift, actually I'm going to make this one green here, Joe. Or horizontal shift comes from what? The horizontal shift comes from our C value. Okay, is our C value. And it moves left or right. Our vertical shift comes from the D value. And D moves, and this is what we'll talk about this in our next video, up or down. And then our intervals, remember, are just a period over 4. Okay, and we also have this, maybe there's the negative flip over x axis. Now you can flip over your y-axis, but we're not going to be discussing that in this course. Okay, so let us try one. Remember now, cosine behaves, all of these a, b, c, and d values behave in the exact same way as they do for sine. Okay, but remember, our sine graph, as we looked at our last slide, looks like this. Starts in the midline, goes to the max. The cosine starts in the max and goes to the midline. Alright, so we're going to graph 2 periods of this function. Alright, y equals 2 times the sine of x minus 1 pi. Okay, well, if I find my amplitude is just 2. It's the absolute value of 2, which is 2. To find my period, I do 2 pi over b. Well, this is not technically factored form, alright, like this is here. There's no b there. So technically, I can take a 1 out of there. And sometimes this is helpful just to see, just so you can see what we're dividing by. Alright, so our period is 2 pi over 1, which is just 2 pi. A horizontal shift minus pi. Remember, on the inside it behaves as the opposite, so I'm going to go right pi. And our intervals is your period divided by 4. So 2 pi over 4, which is pi over 2. Okay? So again, our amplitude was 2. 1, 2. Our midline did not change. There was no vertical shift. So our midline stays the same as well. Alright. Our intervals. Okay, so I move to the right pi. Alright, and I want to stay consistent on how far I go, or how far I move here. So make sure, since we're graphing 2 periods, you give yourself some space. If I move to the right pi, my intervals are pi over 2, right? Which means my next value here, alright, my next value, well, if I add pi to pi over 2, excuse me, if I add pi over 2 to pi, I'll get what? I'll get 3 pi over 2. Notice how if this whole thing is pi, then this distance would be half of that here. So that would be 2 pi. See that? 1, 2 pi. This would be 5 pi over 2. Then 3 pi. So that is 2 pi right there, from 3 pi to pi. 3 minus 1 gives me 2 pi. Okay, so that would be 1 period. This would be 7 pi over 2. 4 pi. 9 pi over 2. And 5er. And 5 pi. Okay. So now we are dealing with sine. Remember what our graph of sine looks like? It looks like that. Okay. We start at the midline. Alright. Start at the midline. Go up to your maximum amplitude. Midline. Minimum amplitude. Midline. That's 1. Sine. That's 1 period. So then max, midline, min, midline. There's 2 periods. Let's see if my connecting the dots is getting better. Oh, see, at the end it always tails off. Alright, so that's about what you should have. Okay. There. How about that? That's pretty neat. Isn't it neat? I think it's pretty neat. Okay, so let's try graphing 2 periods here. Alright, so I'm going to take out that 2. X minus, well, if I do pi divided by 2, that's just pi over 2. Alright. My amplitude is 3. My period is 2 pi over 2, which is just pi. My horizontal shift is right, pi over 2. And my intervals are pi divided by 4, which is just pi over 4. Okay. So, let's throw what we know. We got 1, 2, 3 amplitude. 1, 2, 3, negative 3. Amplitude, midline did not change. No vertical shifts. Alright. What else? Move to the right pi over 2. So I'm going to start about here. Come on, dude. Alright, our intervals are pi over 4. Now, sometimes, like, to make your tick marks, it can be hard to determine what which tick mark or what your next tick mark should be. So you cannot want to think of it as like pi over 2. Not sure why that became green. Plus pi over 4. Well, to add fractions, I need a common denominator. Well, this is 2 pi over 4 plus pi over 4 to get me 3 pi over 4. And that tells me, well, my next tick mark needs to be 3 pi over 4. Add pi over 4, that's 4 pi over 4, which is just pi. Add pi over 4, that's 5 pi over 4. Add pi over 4, that's 6 pi over 4, which is 3 pi over 2. Add pi over 4, that's 7 pi over 4. Add pi over 4, that's 8 pi over 4, which is just 2 pi's. 2 more. Add pi over 4 is 9 pi over 4. And add pi over 4, that's 3 pi's. No, it's off. Sorry, that's not 3 pi. That's 10 pi over 4, which is 5 pi over 2. Confused myself there. Alright, so we're doing with cosine, so that means I start up at the top. Maximum, midline, minimum, midline, max, mid, min, mid, max. Boom, connect your dots. Oh, that's brutal. I just can't have that. Make the dots bigger if they don't connect, or you know that trick. All right, there you go. There's 2 periods of cosine. For the sake of time, we're just going to go one period on this one. Okay, I can think about taking a 1 out here. Okay, my amplitude is 1. My period is 2 pi over 1, which is just 2 pi. My horizontal shift is now to the left, pi over 4. To the left. Okay, so now, and my intervals are 2 pi over 4, which is pi over 2. Okay. So, having said that, if we start to the left, pi over 4. Okay. So I'm at negative pi over 4. My amplitude was 1, negative 1. Midline stays the same. If I start at negative pi over 4, and I add pi over 2, which is 2 pi over 4, I get 1 pi over 4. So my next tick mark should be at pi over 4. If I add pi over 4 again, I get 2 pi over 4, which is pi over 2. If I add pi over 4 again, I apologize, I'm not adding pi over 4, I'm adding pi over 2. So if I add 2 pi's again, I get 3 pi over 4. Add 2 pi's, I get 5 pi over 4. Not adding 2 pi's, but 2 pi, holy buckets. 2 pi over 4. Add 2 pi over 4 again, I get 7 pi over 4. Okay, I'm adding 2 pi over 4 every single time. Alright, and it's cosine, so I start at the top, go to my midline, down, mid, max. Notice how we don't go through 0 here. You don't always have to go through you don't always have to go through 0. It's not required. Pay attention to your values. Okay. My graph's a little messed up here. I should have spaced these out probably a little bit more, but we're going to battle. Okay. You don't always have to go through that point 0. All right. Notice how I traveled 8 pi here. 8 pi over 4, which is 2 pi, which is my period. Alright, why don't you pause this one here and you're going to do this one yourself. Okay, pause it up. Alright, so here's what I came up with. My amplitude was 1, 2 pi over b. I factored out that 3. Remember, pi divided by 3 is pi over 3. So my period is 2 pi over 3. My horizontal shift is the left pi over 3. My intervals are 2 pi over 3 divided by 4, which is like 2 pi over 3 times 1 over 4, which is 2 pi over 12, which is pi over 6. So to realize what my next tick mark will be, I did negative pi over 3 plus pi over 6. Well, negative pi over 3 is negative 2 pi over 6 plus pi over 6, which is negative pi over 6. Alright, so these are my intervals. Those are 2 pi. Okay, those are 2 periods, excuse me. Hopefully this is a little bit better. Alright, we'll practice this some more. In the next video, we'll do some vertical shifts. Wow, can't wait.